Hello and welcome back. So in this lecture, we're going to take a look at network port scanning and a little bit of vulnerability analysis. Now, if you're coming from my ethical hacking course, you are probably familiar with all of the things that we will cover. However, this is an important thing when it comes to securing a network and discovering vulnerabilities on certain network devices. Now, in this lecture, we're going to touch on Nmap tool. Now, if you're in the industry, you probably have heard of the Nmap or of the network mapper tool. It is a common tool that both cybersecurity experts and ethical hackers use, and it is used to scan a certain device or multiple devices for open ports, and it can also be used to discover certain vulnerabilities on those open ports, as well as services running on those open ports, and even more things than just that. Now, of course, in this lecture, we will be touching on just the basics of Nmap, and we will see some a little bit more intermediate stuff with it, but everything else that you want to learn, I highly suggest you read the Nmap manual. Since in the Nmap manual, everything is really well explained, and you will have a detailed explanation of each and every option that Nmap offers us. Nonetheless, to run Nmap, you will need a Linux system. Not so necessarily, it can be run from Windows, but I prefer to run it from Linux. You can find the Nmap website at the link nmap.org. Let me just open the Firefox and I will type it in for you so you can see the Nmap website. Here it will load the official Nmap website. It doesn't look anything special, but now you can read through the introduction to Nmap. You can also read through the Nmap guide and all of that, and you can also download Nmap for your machine. I will currently run this tool from Linux system, or in this particular case from Kali Linux. Close this. And to simply run Nmap help menu, we type nmap --help. It will print out all the available options that we can run with Nmap, and without reading all of this, the most simple command that we can run with Nmap is simply just typing nmap and then the IP address of the target that we want to scan. Now in this particular case, I will use my router's IP, and all I have to do is press enter, and in just a couple of seconds we will get the output back, and I will see all the open ports on my router device. We can see that the host is up. We can see that it didn't show 994 closed TCP ports, and out of the 1000 ports that is scanned, it found 6 open ports, and it also tells us for which type of service are these ports normally used. For example, port 22, as we already know, is port for SSH, port 23 is Telnet, port 53 is DNS, and port 80 and 443 are HTTP and HTTPS, and if you scan your router, you most likely will find some of these ports to be open. Now down here we see the time that it took for this Nmap scan to finish, which in this particular case is 0.68 seconds, but keep in mind that sometimes it can take much longer for these scans to finish. It all depends where your target is, does it have any security measures, and which settings are you using within the tool. All of this will be important to determine for how long will the scan take. Okay. So you might have noticed that it only displays 994 closed ports. This simply means that Nmap by default, when not specified, scans for most common 1000 ports. Now, if you want to scan for less ports, you can type nmap 192.168.1.1, and you can use the P option to specify a single port, for example, let's say port 80, or you can type multiple ports, for example, port 90 and port 100. If I press enter, it will only scan these 3 ports, and once again we will get that the port 80 is open, the port 80 is running HTTP service, and these 2 ports are closed, which is the correct output since, if you remember from the previous scan, we didn't get these to be open, so it says that the state is closed. If you want to scan a range of ports, you can type 192.168.1.1 or whichever IP that you're scanning. Now keep in mind that Nmap is not something that you should run against targets that you don't have permission to, so only use Nmap on the targets that are inside your network and that you have permission to scan. To scan a range report, you also use the -P option, and you can type 80-120, for example. It only found the port 80 to be open. Other 40 ports are closed TCP ports. Okay, awesome. Now let me just enlarge this a little bit. And another useful option that you might use, especially when your scans are running slower and you do want to scan for most common ports, but you don't really want to do all 1000 ports. You want to do less than that. You can use the -F option. So once you type -F, it will only scan for the top 100 ports of your target machine, or top 100 most common ports. If I press enter, we will get the same output back, but here you will see that it only scanned 95 plus this 5, which is exactly 100 ports. Since these right here belong to the more common ports and services, they are being displayed. Okay. Now let's go back to the help menu and let's see which different type of scans can we run using Nmap. So if you want to see different type of scans, it is right here, right under the scan techniques. You will have different options such as -SS, -ST, -SA, and even more different types of scans if we look down below. Now you can read through all of this and figure out what each of these scans do, but most often you will use these two scans, -SS and -ST. Now, here we have a short explanation. -SS is a TCP SYN scan, while -ST is the full connect scan. What is the difference? Well, the difference is that the -ST option will perform a full connection to the port, and -SS will only perform the SYN scan or the first part of the TCP handshake. Now, the difference is when it comes to hacking and cybersecurity that this will be less detectable than this one. And it's common sense since this will perform the full connection while this will only perform the first part of the connection to determine which ports are open and which ports are closed. So if detection is something that you care about, then using -SS might be a better option. Now, to run the scan, you simply just type nmap -SS 192.168.1.1, and this will not work. This is because this type of scan, or the SYN scan, requires root privileges. To do that, we can type sudo, and on Windows I imagine that it will require administrator privileges, though I have never really used Nmap on Windows systems, so it might work without that as well. If I run with sudo, it will work and it will give the same output back, but this time it performed the TCP SYN scan. So only the first part of the TCP handshake is being performed on each of these ports, and we still manage to determine which ones are open and which ones are closed. The same output we will get with the -ST scan, just this time it won't ask for the administrator privileges, it will simply just do the scan and give the same output back, but this time it did the full connection to each of these ports. The entire TCP three-way handshake has been performed to connect to these ports and determine which ones are closed and which ones are open. Now, if you want to read about more types of scans, you can still go to the help menu, but what I do advise and what I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture is to use the Nmap manual instead. Since here in the Nmap help menu, we can see the description of each of these scan techniques or pretty much of any other option that Nmap offers us, but this won't be explained in details and you might struggle to understand some of these options. To fully understand and to fully read about these options, you can type man nmap which is shortened for manual of Nmap, and you can scroll through this entire manual and figure out what each of these options do. At the beginning here we will have our regular Nmap help menu, which will cover the options just briefly, but if we scroll all the way down, you will start seeing each of these options being explained in details. Let's try to find our scans that we performed just to see what the difference is, even though I did explain, but let's just double check to see whether I was right. Okay, so after a little bit of scrolling, here is an important part that you want to read through if you are interested in learning Nmap tool. So here is what I already mentioned. The simple command nmap target scans 1000 TCP ports on the host target. We already know that, I already said that, but down here you want to read through this, the 6 port states recognized by Nmap. So we saw open, we saw closed, we also can have a filtered port, which simply means that it's most likely behind a firewall. We can also have unfiltered, open pipe filtered, and closed pipe filtered. You want to read through all of this to figure out what each of these means. Now these two are pretty much straightforward. When the port is open, it's open. When it says it's closed, the port is closed. Let's go down here. And here are the scan types that we performed. So -SS, which we already mentioned to be TCP SYN scan, and here is the explanation of what it is. Here is what I mentioned. This technique is often referred to as half-open scanning because you don't open a full TCP connection, you just send the SYN packet. So this is how the TCP SYN scan works, while the TCP connect scan performs the full connection to the port. You can read through the entire description and you will figure out what the difference is between these two scans. One more thing is that this one will take a little bit more time since it does perform the full TCP connection compared to the SYN scan, but in certain cases you will need to use this one, while in other cases you will most likely use this one. Nonetheless, you can read through all the other type of scans such as UDP scans, which is -SU option, and if you scroll all the way down you will see everything else. Now if we were to go through this entire manual, it will take way too long time, so we're just going to show a couple of more options that Nmap offers us, and then we're going to move on to the next lecture. I do strongly advise that you do continue learning about Nmap since it is a rather important tool in cybersecurity field, especially when it comes to network security. Okay, so we covered the -SS scan, the -ST scan, but let's take a look at the -SV scan. What is -SV? We haven't read it in the manual, but it's simply an Nmap scan that will perform the version discovery on services that are running on open ports. For example, if let's say an Apache is running on port 80 as a web server, well then this command will try to figure out which version of Apache is running. Why is this useful? Well, it's useful because if we notice an outdated version on a certain port, then we can further on proceed to try and find any type of vulnerability for that outdated version. Let me show you how this scan works. We will simply just use my router again. So this is the command. And once you run it, you will notice that it does take a little bit more time than the previous two scans, and this is because this is a more detailed scan. It does have to find open ports, find services running on those open ports, and also determine what is the version of those services that are running on open ports. Now, anytime that Nmap takes a little bit longer to finish, you can use upper arrow to figure out at what percentage is Nmap at. See right here, we can see that it's currently at 83.30% done, and every time you press upper arrow, it will tell you at what percentage is the scan currently at. Now here it is, we got the scan finished, and you will notice the first thing is that we get a larger output. The part that we are mostly interested in is this one right here. So besides these three columns that we already had with the previous two scans, which are which ports are open, what state they are at, and the services running, we also get the version. So the TCP, or the port that is running SSH service, is running dropbear SSH 2014.63. So we get the exact same version, and we get this for each and every service that is currently running on my router. Now, if I was to try and discover vulnerabilities, the first step would be to research about this specific version and trying to find online whether there is any exploit or vulnerability that exists for this specific version, and if it does, I would try to exploit it. Now, this is more on the offensive side, but also as a cybersecurity expert, you need to discover vulnerabilities to know what you need to secure. You can't just perform the scans, you will also have to figure out whether any of these versions right here is vulnerable to some type of exploit or DDoS attack or pretty much anything at all. All of this should go in a report, which will then let the network administrator or someone else that is in the charge of network update any outdated software and remove any type of other services running that shouldn't be there or that might present a threat. For example, right here, and once again, if you're coming from my ethical hacking course, you will be familiar with this machine right here, but this is simply just a vulnerable virtual machine that I'm currently running just to show you how the scan will look like for this machine. Now, you won't really have this machine available for you, but in case you want to test your Nmap skills on this machine, you can download it. Just type in Metasploitable download on the Google and you should find download links for this machine. Right now I want to find out the IP address, so I'll just type ifconfig and it's 0.1.7, and all I have to do is type the same scan but just change the IP address, and it will perform the scan on this target as well. Let's wait for it to finish. And here are the results. So we do get quite a few ports open on this machine, and we also get the versions of these services that are running. Now, since I already tested this machine and anyone that's coming from the hacking course already covered this entire machine and all the exploits, I already know that a bunch of these services are vulnerable, and you can find exploits for any particular service just by researching their version name. For example, if you type this version name in Google, the first thing that will come out is the exploit that you can use to run and exploit this vulnerable machine to gain access to it. All of this is important because if you discover something like this inside a company network, for example, it should be written down in the report as a critical vulnerability, especially if you can get access to that machine through that vulnerability. After that, this specific service should be patched or updated, or a different software should be used that doesn't have any vulnerabilities. Now, another useful Nmap command besides this one is -o. This command is used when you want to discover an operating system that the target is running. Now, this does require sudo privileges, so I'll just run it, and keep in mind that this command is not always accurate. Sometimes it will give false information, but in many cases it does give the correct operating system that the target is running. The information will be down here, right below the port scan, and you will be able to read what Nmap thinks that the target is running. So Nmap says that the target is running Linux, and you can test this. For example, if you have a Windows machine at home, you can try to scan it with the -o command and see whether Nmap will be able to figure out whether it's a Windows machine or Linux machine or Mac OS. And one more thing is the -a command. Now this -a command stands for all. It will scan for ports, for versions, for operating systems, and I'm not sure it might even scan for different scripts. Now this is one of the commands that will take the longest to finish since it does perform a bunch of things, but when you want to perform everything on a target machine without having to run multiple scans, you can just simply use -a and it will perform the OS scan, the version scan, and the port scan. And last but not least, it's important to know about using scripts in Nmap. So there are certain script scans that you can run with the Nmap tool, and you can read which script scans can you run from the Nmap manual. You can also read about that on their website, but currently the most interesting script to us is the vulnerability script. You can type nmap --script and then space vuln, and then the IP address of your target machine, and in this particular case I will purposely use the vulnerable machine to see whether this script scan will be able to find some vulnerabilities on this virtual machine. If I run it, and here are the results. Now you might have noticed that this can take quite some time to finish. As it says right here, it took around 350 seconds for this scan to finish in my particular case, and this is when the target is in my own network, so it will probably take even more if the target was somewhere else. And here are all the results of all the scans that was ran on the target machine and all the scripts that it performed to discover certain vulnerabilities. Now you can see there is quite some output, and all of this will be something that you want to read through to discover whether certain vulnerabilities exist or not. And right here is where it starts. So it starts from the first port, which is the FTP port. It already discovered that this port is vulnerable. You can see it right here in capital letters, and it does tell you whether this specific vulnerabilities is exploitable or not, and if it is, it will be written right here, and you will also get the CVE of this specific vulnerability, so you can just type this in Google and figure out what this vulnerability is. You also get a little bit of explanation right here. You can see when this vulnerability came out, and you can see also the exploit results. So with a simple shell command of ID, we already managed to get the root privileges, so this would be a critical type of vulnerability since it exploits the target with the root privileges. Then it goes port by port, and for the SMTP port it found another vulnerability right here, the SSL poodle information leak, and down here we can see the CVE, which once again you can paste in Google and read more about this specific vulnerability. Now all the things that we saw down here, we saw a bunch of links. This is probably linked to the port 80 and port 443. Here it was searching for the possible SQL injections, and here are the possible SQL queries that might be vulnerable to SQL injection. All of these links, and in a real penetration test you would test each and every one of these links to figure out whether they are vulnerable to the SQL injection or not. Now there are certain tools that automate this process, but sometimes you have to do it all manually. And since this is purposely made vulnerable virtual machine, most of these actually do have some injection type of vulnerability, especially on the web pages, and not just the SQL injection. Down here it performed even more scans and script scans, and here we can see the HTTP slow loris check. It's once again another vulnerability that is discovered on this machine, and all of this you would write down inside the report for this specific machine to let everyone know that it isn't secure and that it should be either patched or removed completely from the network. Even more vulnerabilities right here. Now we're skipping through all of this since it would take quite some time for us to read this, but anyways, this is the command that you can use to perform the script scan to discover vulnerabilities on certain ports. Now, of course, if this scan returns no vulnerabilities, it doesn't mean that there are no vulnerabilities on the target system. It just means that this specific option didn't manage to discover them. Then you have to go with either other tools, or you have to go and try to discover vulnerabilities manually. Another thing that you should know is that you don't have to scan just one target when it comes to Nmap. You can scan multiple targets. For example, I can just type 192.168.1.1-20, and it should scan the first 20 targets. But just so this can finish faster, I'll remove the script scan and we'll just perform the normal Nmap default scan. It should go through each and every IP address in this range, and it should first determine whether that IP is active and running, if any device is using it, and then if it is, then it will print out whether that device has any open ports. Let's press upper arrow. We can see that in this range we have 6 devices that are up, and it's currently performing the connect scan on each of these devices to determine the open ports. It's 85% done, so let's wait for it to finish. And here are the results. You also could have noticed that it did take quite some time to finish, and this is because we scanned multiple devices and not just one. So we get the output for our vulnerable virtual machine. We already saw this, it has a bunch of ports open. Here is the output for some other machine, and if I'm not mistaken, this is most likely my Windows machine. And here we also have some other devices. This particular device is running just one open port, or is having just one open port, and it's most likely an iPhone due to the service that this port is running. Here we have another device that is up and running, but this particular device has all 1000 scanned ports closed. We can see that it is a Huawei device and all the ports on that device are closed. And here is the output for my router. It has all the standard ports open that we already saw, so this would pretty much be about it. All these 6 devices and their outputs. Down here we have another device that has all 1000 scan ports closed. Okay, awesome. Now this would be the basics of Nmap. And don't worry if you didn't get much out of this lecture. If it's your first time encountering Nmap tool, it will take some practice to get used to it. It is a rather large tool, and with time you will be able to master it. It is useful, and I do advise you to read through the Nmap manual and to read through different options that you can use with Nmap to perform your scans on the network. It will boost your skills in securing the network and discovering different vulnerabilities on the network. Now, when it comes to vulnerability analysis, this would be just the first part, discovering open ports and discovering services and their versions. After that, as I already mentioned, you will have to research through each of these versions of the services that are running and figure out whether any of them has any existing vulnerabilities. That would be the second part, and if it does have the existing vulnerability, you would notify someone to perform an update or to change the software that is running. Nonetheless, this would be all about the basics, so thank you for watching. Once again, if you didn't understand most of the things, just rewatch this lecture multiple times, and after some time you will get used to it and you will master Nmap. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lecture.